Hello, thank you for joining us today. I'd like to start by acknowledging my co-authors, Matt Kondratiev, Matt Robinson, and Greg Poliski. We'll be presenting today on our evaluation of the fishery response to stream restoration on the Upper Arkansas River in Colorado. So I'm going to start with a brief outline for the presentation. We'll begin with a little discussion on the legacy of mining in the Upper Arkansas River headwaters, including the California Gulch Superfund site. Talk a little bit about the habitat restoration project and how we use fish population monitoring to evaluate the effectiveness of that project. So this story really begins in 1860 when gold was discovered in California Gulch outside of present-day Leadville, Colorado. So the gold was extracted with placer mining techniques. And as you can see on the screen in front of you, this is Little Johnny, the world's richest gold mine in California Gulch, Colorado. You can see that these extraction techniques for placer mining were quite destructive to the stream bed and surrounding area. It's really highlighted here in this photo, which shows hydraulic mining in California Gulch. And you can just see the depth of disturbance that was caused through these mining techniques and just how much sediment was mobilized and disturbed to be then available for transport downstream during future flooding events. So not just disturbance to the channel, but the adjacent floodplain as well. So the gold boom lasted about 5 years in California Gulch. And they thought that that might be the end of Leadville after the gold dried up. However, silver was discovered in 1876. And so silver was extracted with hard rock mining techniques. So here you can see a number of mine shafts. These are mine houses over the top of those shafts. And so those mine shafts go down to the ground following the veins of ores, and they extract that ore, and then they have to process it at the nearby smelters. So a few of the issues associated with these mining practices was first the waste that was created through the extraction of these metals. So you can see mine waste piles on the hill slope adjacent to California Gulch in this photo. In addition to the mine waste that was created, there were problems with water management in the tunnels. As the tunnels went deeper and deeper, or as the shafts went deeper and deeper, they filled with water. So the solution to that water management problem was to create mine drainage tunnels underneath the mine shafts that would drain the water out of the shafts and allow those mines to continue to operate. So as water flowed through those drainage tunnels, they interacted with the parent material, resulting in acid mine drainage, causing point sources of metal pollution coming out of those mine drainage tunnels. Finally, the processing of the ore at the local smelters caused air pollution that actually resulted in acid mine or acid rain at times. And so that air pollution also was deposited throughout the headwaters. So all of this degradation took a toll on the natural resources in the Arkansas River headwaters. So here you can see a photo of maybe the only photo of yellowfin cutthroat trout that we have today. So native trout populations, cutthroat trout populations in Colorado were decimated by overfishing, mining pollution, and agricultural practices in the 1800s. On top of that, state and federal agencies began propagation and stocking of both native and introduced trout species in the early 1880s. So all of that culminated in a lot of pressure on the yellowfin cutthroat trout. Particularly, it was seen as a food source to feed those miners in Leadville. So the native trout of the Arkansas River headwaters, this yellowfin cutthroat trout, is the only one of 6 lineages of cutthroat trout that are native to Colorado that we now believe to be extinct. And so that really highlights the degree of disturbance that occurred in the Arkansas River headwaters that unfortunately, apparently led to the extinction of this unique native cutthroat trout in Colorado. And so this photo here is the picture of 3 trout presented to President William Henry Harrison in Buena Vista, Colorado in 1891. So all of this metals pollution and natural resources damages led to designation of the California Gulch Superfund site. It was added to the National Priorities List in 1983, and the EPA began remediation in 1986. Remediation included treating those point sources of acid mine drainage, those mine drainage tunnels. And so those were remediated in the early 90s. And then fluvial tailing deposits represent non-point sources of metals pollution. And so these are that mine waste that was, mobilized during flooding events, transported downstream, deposited within and on the banks of the Arkansas River. So pilot remediation projects began in the late 90s, and then the bulk of the remediation of fluvial tailing deposits occurred in 2008 and 2009. Concurrently to these remediation activities, a natural resource damage assessment led to a $20.5 million settlement under CERCLA. The Environmental Assessment and Restoration Plan was released in 2010 and included 3 tiers of restoration projects. So here's an overview of the California Gulch Superfund site. You can see the boundary of the California Gulch Superfund site is shown in the diagonal crosshatching. Individual mines are shown in the purple and black X's on the screen. The high density of purple X's on the east side of California Gulch is what's known as the Leadville Mining District. You can see the location of the Leadville Mine Drainage Tunnel and the Yak Tunnel there on your screen. Both of those tunnels received treatment plants to address those point sources of metals pollution. You can see the fluvial deposits along the Arkansas River floodplain shown in red. The Arkansas River is flowing from north to south on your screen, from the top of the screen to the bottom of the screen. The Sugarloaf Mining District, albeit smaller than the Leadville Mining District, was also another source of metals pollution that was targeted for remediation. Irrigation of grazing pastures and hay meadows also caused problems, as the water that was being used from irrigation from the Arkansas River was laden with heavy metals. So over time, those metals accumulated in the soil and rendered those areas unsuitable for the growth of vegetation. So that was another thing that was targeted for remediation by the EPA. Trans-mountain diversions also contributed to habitat degradation in the Arkansas River, particularly valve-on, valve-off operations or rapid drawdown from reservoir releases led to exacerbated issues with bank erosion in the Arkansas River, particularly in areas where you have these denuded fluvial tailing deposits. So there was no stabilizing riparian vegetation to help hold those stream banks together. So over time, you get over widening of the channel and degradation of in-stream trout habitat. So all this culminated in identifying an 11-mile reach of the Lake Fork and Arkansas River that would be targeted for in-stream habitat restoration after completion of remediation activities. So just to highlight the improved water quality through time, here you can see total zinc concentrations on the top of the screen and total cadmium concentrations on the bottom of the screen. So you can see historically from the 70s into the early 90s, those concentrations could be quite high. In the late 90s, early 2000, there's a marked improvement in those concentrations of metals in the Arkansas River. That marked improvement in water quality led to a marked improvement in the brown trout population. So brown trout are the only fish that can survive in the Arkansas River as it is today. There's still some lingering metals concentration, lingering issues with metal pollution in the watershed. So brown trout are the only naturally reproducing fish in the Arkansas River at the vast majority of our study sites. So as you look at changes in the brown trout population through time, we're looking at fish density on the left of the screen, fish biomass on the right of the screen. These are averages with 95% confidence intervals for all sites within the California Gulch Superfund site. And you can see that marked improvement in both fish density and biomass around the year 2000. So that kind of coincides with that improvement in water quality that we see in the water quality data. And however, there's some subtle differences between the changes in density and biomass. After an improvement, the dashed line is a 10-year mooning average. So you see that improved density around the year 2000, but then it appears to plateau through the later half of that decade and into the 2010s. So a little different for fish biomass, where we see a marked improvement occurring in around the year 2000, but that continues to climb. It doesn't have that same plateau. So the improvement in water quality and associated improvement in flow management with the Fry Arc project led to designation of more than 100 miles of the Arkansas River as a gold medal trout fishery in 2014. And this designation occurred prior to habitat restoration. So the fishery had a very positive response to improved water quality and met our gold medal criteria for Colorado, which include a standing stock of 60 pounds per acre for biomass and at least 12 quality trout per acre. And we define quality trout as a trout with a total length of 14 inches or greater. So this brings us to the Arkansas River Habitat Restoration Project. So that gold medal designation, those improvements in the trout fishery, they included, that happened prior to habitat restoration. So the thought was that there was still some carrying capacity there that could be elevated with improved in-stream habitat. So this was a tier 1 restoration project, and the environmental assessment and restoration plan, again, addressed that 11 miles of the Arkansas River and Lake Fork, habitat degradation associated with those historic land use practices, both mining practices and agricultural practices, and then trans-mountain water diversions. Objectives of the project were to increase brown trout population and individual fish health, with a target for a 10% increase in fish metrics by year 5, which is 2018. That 10% increase was really targeted for impact sites relative to control. The project was implemented from 2012 to 2014. Colorado Parks and Wildlife was responsible for design and implementation of the project on lands with public fishing access, which was the lower 5 miles of that 11-mile reach. And then the Lake County Conservation District, NRCS, and private landowners worked in cooperation to implement habitat restoration projects on those private lands, that upper 6 miles of the 11-mile reach. I want to give you some example of some of the treatments that were used by CPW. Objectives of these treatments were to stabilize stream banks, particularly in the vicinity of those fluvial tailing deposits. So those fluvial deposits were treated in situ. They were not removed. And so they need some time to get vegetation reestablished on in those areas. So stabilizing those stream banks would not only improve in-stream habitat by addressing the over-wide channel conditions, but they would also buy some time to get that natural control on lateral stability, being riparian vegetation. So due to the accelerated bank erosion associated with fluvial deposits and the lack of riparian vegetation, there were issues with bank erosion and downstream sedimentation. So that was one of the things we wanted to address through in-stream habitat treatments. Also wanted to provide overhead cover for trout and improve overwinter habitat for trout. Finally, wanted to promote diverse stream morphology to support a variety of prey resources and life stages for brown trout. Here's some of the treatments that were used on the CPW project reach, including pool development and channel narrowing. I do want to point out CPW imported 9,000 cubic yards of fill to support channel narrowing, improve sediment transport processes, and improve floodplain connectivity. We also use a lot of wood in our treatments, including wood tow, log veins, did some log boulder vein combinations. And as I previously mentioned, a lot of emphasis on reestablishing riparian vegetation. So riparian seeding, sod mat, and willow transplants, also willow staking and willow planting. And finally, we included some boulder clusters to try to provide some in-stream velocity refuge for those trout. There was a bit of a difference between the treatments used on private versus public lands, although the projects had the same general goals and objectives. The private lands tend to use a lot of boulder structures, in particular boulder J-hooks, boulder cross veins, grade control. They did not want their structures to float away during floods, and so they tended to use a lot more rock versus wood. Versus the project on public lands, again, I mentioned that we imported 9,000 cubic yards of fill, and that was predominantly cobble-sized material. So there's a cobble bar that was created with that imported fill, and you can see vegetation starting to grow on that. So improving those sediment transport processes and floodplain connection to try to improve some of those reestablishment of riparian vegetation. Public project also used a lot more wood, as I mentioned, including log veins and wood tows, as shown in the picture there. Fish population surveys were conducted to evaluate the brown trout population response to these treatments. Focused exclusively on brown trout, as I mentioned, the only natural reproducing river at the fish in the Arkansas River for the majority of our study sites. Used 2 pass depletion estimates with electrofishing to come up with fish population estimates. Did that at 10 monitoring sites throughout the upper Arkansas watershed. We had 2 periods. We wanted to look how things changed between the before period and after period. Our sites were treated in different years, so each site has a unique range of before and after data. However, in general, the before period was from 2006 to 2013, and the after period was from 2014 to 2018. We had 5 control and 5 impact sites to support our BACI study design. You can see those sites listed on your screen. So good balance there from a control versus impact site. And then we did want to look at changes within a few site categories. In particular, there's 2 upstream control sites that are above the California Gulch Superfund site. Then we had 2 private sites that used a lot more rock than wood. And those are a site AR3A and AR4. And then those lower 6 sites are all within the public project that CPW worked on. And we have 3 impact and 3 control sites dispersed throughout the extent of that project. We looked at 4 fish metrics to evaluate changes before and after restoration, including brown trout density, brown trout biomass. We wanted to look at biomass and density, as 2 sites could have very similar densities, but very different biomasses. With that, if a site has a higher biomass, but a similar density, that would imply there's a better size structure to that population and that there's bigger fish occurring at that site. As far as bigger fish go, we also look at the number of quality of trout. Again, that's the any trout with a total length of 14 inches or more. To look at fish condition or health, we used relative weight, and we looked at how the relative weight for individual fish changed from before and after at each one of our sites. So we did a site-specific analysis. We looked at changes at individual sites, and then we combined all our data together into a BACI analysis using a repeated measure mixed effects ANOVA, where we included period and type as a categorical effect, and we included discharge on the day of the survey as a continuous effect. So moving into our site-specific results, we only had 1 site that saw a significant increase in any metrics. This was site AR3A. It is the first site located downstream of California Gulch, where we saw a 99% increase in biomass and a 306% increase in quality. And so we think the changes to this site reflect both improved habitat condition associated with in-stream restoration, but may also reflect improved water quality over time, being that it is the first site downstream of California Gulch. When we look at the percent change shown on the y-axis in this figure across those site categories, we can see how some of these different site categories differed in their response or lack thereof to restoration. So throwing that 10% target up there on the screen, we can see at our upstream control sites, we had about a 10% increase in both density and biomass. As we move downstream into our private and public impact sites, we can see a slightly larger increase in density at those sites relative to the upstream control, and a much larger increase in biomass at those sites relative to both upstream and downstream control sites. So this implies that those habitat treatments at those impact sites really move the needle, particularly with respect to biomass. Conversely, although the changes are not statistically significant, there is an apparent decline in quality trout at these sites. So that's something we want to continue to monitor through time. And maybe we're seeing these increased densities are translating into less capacity to support bigger fish in the system. We did see increases in relative weight across sites and categories, albeit below the 10% goal that we were hoping for. So moving on to the BACI results, we saw a 10% increase in density for all sites, but no difference between control and impact sites. Now, there are no migration barriers between our sites, so the fish are free to swim between control and impact sites. So this may be an overall increase in density that could in fact be associated with habitat restoration. For biomass, we saw a 17% increase across all sites, with 12% increase at control sites, 21% increase at impact sites. So biomass is right there for that 20% change at impact relative to control, coming in about 9% right now. So that's a pretty positive result that we've observed from this study. No significant change in quality despite those apparent declines at some sites and categories. We did see significantly higher relative weight or fish condition at control sites, so that was a positive result. And then we saw a 2.5% increase in relative weight for all sites. So in summary, the BACI design improved our analytical power to detect statistical changes and make inference about the effectiveness of this project. Density, biomass, and relative weight all improved, and the overall trends for the site are positive. All sites are maintaining gold medal status, which is a big priority for CPW, particularly given this is a relatively new designation back in 2014. So looking at it in 2018, we're still maintaining those, and that's something we're going to want to continue to monitor into the future. And so we do recommend additional monitoring to continue to evaluate this project and inform adaptive management. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take those. My email is on the bottom of the screen, and I thank you for your time and attention.